This Delaware County Historical Society program, Delaware County Industrial History, Rubber Products, was given by Steve Schmitt on January 18, 2023. This was a virtual presentation using Zoom instead of in person because driving at night in winter weather can be challenging.
Thank you for attending. This is for my second program I've put on with industrial history. We did one back in May about foundries in Delaware, and some of those show up again in this presentation. I'm Steve Schmitt. I'm the programs committee chairman for the Historical Society. So what we want to talk about tonight is the Delaware Commercial Club, the K&W Rubber / Climax Rubber Company, the Rainbow Rubber Company, and the Delaware Rubber Company. The Delaware Commercial Club is interesting. As I was doing the research for the Foundry program back in the teens and 20s, they kept showing up, and it got me curious about that organization. And what I found, this is mostly coming out of the Delaware Daily Journal Herald newspapers that have been digitized at the Ohio Memory site. It's an organization of businessmen with the mission of fostering and encouraging any proposition that will benefit Delaware and its citizens. And they maintain rooms. First, they were at the corner of North Sandusky and Central, right across from the courthouse. And this building was Potter and Reed Grocery. And when I was younger, it was Sullivan's Western Auto Store for years. Later on, they had rooms at the YMCA on West Winter Street. And they had monthly meetings, and they covered a variety of topics, but a lot of ranging topics. Professors from Ohio Wesleyan, so it was a very interesting group. It was mostly made up of Delaware's businessmen and some industrials, but there's some notable ones that were missing. But of course, the businessmen were looking for businesses would come in and provide jobs, which would mean more business for their companies. Like William Morrison was the president of Delaware Underwear Factory. Eugene Pollock was at Delaware National Bank. Samuel Blair founded Sunray. Fred Barre family still had a shoe store up into the 60s and 70s. Merrill Russell was president of Sunray, and later he and his son founded Dello Screw, which still exists out on London Road. And they would make up a committee. If a city wanted some help or somebody had a problem, they would put a committee together to look into things such as new factories that wanted to move to Delaware or were looking for a proposal. They would get involved with things like Delaware was considering purchasing, they eventually did, but when they were deciding whether or not to purchase the Delaware Water Company, the commercial club put a committee together to help study that. And then they did fundraisers. They were involved in the Delaware Pumpkin Show, which went on. They got into a lot of interesting projects, such as the Odavine Spring that was where Selby Field is. There was a proposal to build a sanitarium there to take advantage of the spring waters, but also provide medical help. And they promoted that. They tried to help. They had meetings. They were trying to promote people buying shares of common stock in the company. In 1909, they lobbied the Methodist Book Concern. It was a big printing operation for the Methodist Church. They wanted them to build one printing plant in Delaware. When the big four railroad shops were slowing down their work in Delaware, they lobbied to try to save jobs. At one point, Delaware was trying to figure out a better way to clean the streets. They still had horses in those days. They got into they helped raise funds to help the Delaware Gas Company keep Cook Motors in town by extending their pipes. So Cook Motors, which was on the Hocking Valley Railroad, would leave town. At one point, the Jerk was the local train for the big four that went out to Springfield. And there was a proposal they wanted them to stop at South Sandusky, where the hardware exchange is now, and let people off rather than take them all the way to the station at Lake Street. And they worked. My screen is not letting me see this last bullet. So, the Methodist Children's Home, Delaware was one of the candidates for locating the Methodist Children's Home, which ultimately went to Worthington. But they lobbied hard to get that placed in Delaware. They proposed a site where Grady Hospital is, but there wasn't enough acreage for what the Children's Home wanted. In 1912, C&E Shoe was a company in Columbus, but they needed to expand, and the commercial club kicked in money and land at the site on East William, which is right next to the Nash House across the street. There was a shoe factory, which later was a casket factory. In 1914, they helped Robert Greer start his Delaware Machine and Foundry Company on Toledo Street, which was one of the companies we talked about on the foundry. They tried to get the local Eagles, help them get the state Eagles Lodge or state office into Delaware. Then when they were trying to replace the Winter Street Bridge after the flood in 1913, they were involved in working with the Pennsylvania Railroad about were they going to relocate, were they going to stay, because they really didn't want to do the bridge until they knew what the railroad was going to do. They raised money, $10,000, to help K&W Rubber relocate to Delaware. And an interesting one, in 1919, they were supporting, after the flood in 1913, there was a proposal to build a new canal from Lake Erie to the Ohio River, coming down the Sandusky River and then down the Scioto River, which really would have been interesting. Seems kind of late, but it was out there. And then 1920, there was the gas company they were into natural gas and no longer coal gas, and they wanted a price hike, and they negotiated with them to get more service in exchange for their increase in price. They also helped Delaware Brass Foundry move to Delaware, which is the new plant down on East Harrison Street that we talked about in May. They helped Climax Rubber when they came in. We're trying to raise money for an expansion. They tried to get a tomato seed plant located in Delaware, but they needed farmers to commit 50 acres of tomatoes in order to get enough seeds to be able to package them. And then in 1921, they got very involved with the city, who was almost bankrupt, and ways to help them increase revenues. So it was we had a wide range of projects they got into, but it was all for, to help Delaware. Now, a lot of times the club members then were on the boards of companies they helped bring to Delaware. In 1921, it seemed interest was waning, and they reorganized and had a membership drive and wound up with over 600 members, including Senator Frank Willis. In 1922, they already had, not really sure, they had a Chamber of Commerce, but they voted to change their name to the Chamber of Commerce. We also found that there were many towns that had commercial clubs doing equivalent thing, trying to bring employers into the town. Waldo had one, Magnetic Springs had one. We'll see later, Columbus had a club, a very significant club. But anyway, I kind of wanted to cover that because it helps explain a lot of these companies coming to Delaware. I want to start with K&W Rubber, which this is the Delaware County Engineering Building on Channing Street. And in 1908, Ora and Guy Critchbaum started K&W Rubber in Ashland, and Waring had a patent application for a tire protector, and it was granted. And I think he was the W in K&W, Critchbaum and Waring. But the patent was assigned to Critchbaum, and it's basically a thick rubber liner that was inserted between the inner tube and the tire that would protect the inner tube. And even when the tire wore out, you still had a thick rubber liner. They trademarked it as the Maxo tire in 1913. This is the Waring patent, and the arrow points to the thick rubber liner that was in between the inner tube and the tire itself. It's basically to protect or prevent access of pointed articles to the inner tube. This was granted in January of 1910. And a lot of back in those days, there's an early Cadillac, and you can see the tires are still more like bicycle tires, a balloon tire. They didn't have a big, thick tread on them at that point. So they did wear out and they were easy to puncture. So that was kind of what led to the need for these protectors. I was interested. I was watching a show about Powell Crosley, and he actually got started making a similar product, which Crosley from Cincinnati with Crosley radios and Crosley cars and appliances. But he got started making a tire protector, which he's called the inside tire. um, and then Brent Eshelman was another employee of the company who developed the process for making these tube liners and patented it. Again, assigned that to Guy Critchbaum. And then Guy Critchbaum actually had his own patent for an improvement of the Maxa tire to basically allow them with the wire and flat design to be able to come up with different sizes for tires and inner tubes for different vehicles. There's a lot of marketing and trade magazines. There's one that shows how the tire wears out, but the tire protector inside is still good and you can still drive. This is from a 1918 Hardware World trade journal. There's another one in 1916 in the Gas Review. It's claiming that auto racing may no longer be considered dangerous. The blowout resulting in death or serious injury is a thing of the past. And it's the picture of the car with the racer. I'm not sure that's completely true, but they claimed it. And you can see that since 1916, they were still located in Ashland, Ohio, down at the bottom of the advertisement. There's a found on eBay sign for Maxo tires. So the Delaware Commercial Club influenced the Critchbaums, and actually the Critchbaums joined the commercial club to move production to Delaware. And they built the plant at the factory at 50 Channing Street. It was right beside the Big Four railroad tracks. And they were making 500 Maxo tires a day. They also made inner tubes and blowout patches. They had 80 to 90 people working there, 10 to 12 office workers. City Council directed Delaware Water Company to extend water service to the plant. And then this was a picture of the original plant, again, out of the Delaware Daily Journal Herald. And this was on a 10-acre lot next to the old fairgrounds. And on the other side of the building was an open field, and they built a ball field there. And all through the newspapers, the sports section, there's all the industrial leagues, and they had a lot of games were played at the K&W ball field. They also had a railroad siding from the Big Four. And in 1919, they added on to the factory. I think the reason that they were going to start making their own rubber impregnated fabric, which is what you use to actually make up the tire before you put it in a press and compress it and bake it to form the tire. And added another 45,000 feet. And this is a drawing out of one of the Sanborn fire maps from, I think this was the 1923 version. Then in 1920, Climax Rubber bought the company. This was Irving Hoffman was the president, and he mostly out of the insurance industry, but at one point he worked for the Delaware Phone Company, and he had connections with enterprising businessmen, which would be the commercial club again. And they bought the business. Critchbaum stayed involved in it. They invested and they remained with the company. And this was an ad for Climax made what they called a compression tube. They made an inner tube, and K&W made Maxo tires. And with those two things, you would consider yourself kind of impervious to punctures. But Climax Rubber started in Columbus, and their factory was in Huntington, West Virginia. And the feature of their inner tube was that it had more rubber than needed, and when expanded, the rubber is compressed so that the punctures are automatically sealed by compression. When I mentioned other cities having commercial clubs, well, Columbus had a 500,000 club, and they were pressing to have Climax relocate there. And at one point, the Dispatch reported that they had actually bought a site down on the corner of Goodale Avenue and Northwest Boulevard. But then they actually wound up buying the K&W rubber plant instead. Well, this is the patent for Climax's inner tube. And you can see all the dimples. That's what puts the excess rubber in, so that in theory, when you inflate that, all that rubber just turns into a thicker wall. I'm not really sure if I understand that this really would work, but the dimples are flattened by inflation, and then you get a self-sealing inner tube. There was a mold design that was also patented by Nathaniel Worth of Columbus, and both patents were assigned to Climax. So Climax thought they could really run with this, and one of their logic was that K&W was doing very well selling Maxo tires, and K&W really wasn't working very hard at it. They didn't really have a marketing department. Climax was going to market these, and they really were going to go somewhere with it. So they hired a guy, Frank Wilson, who it says was friends with Frank Willis, that became a senator, and eventually was going to run for president, and Warren G. Harding, who was president. That he was a newspaper man in Kenton, was instrumental in bringing Willis into the political limelight when he was a professor at Ohio Northern University. They had published many testimonials in newspapers, trade magazines. Everything moved to Delaware. The Huntington plant was closed, and everything shifted to Delaware. Machinery from there was arriving in December of 1920, and they also opened a sales room at 48 North Sandusky. And Wilson, he was a marketer. They did all kinds of publicity stunts. They had Samuel Potter Burrell Research. They hired them to write a report, and it predicted that their tube that won't leak air would put Akron rubber companies out of business. They had a motion picture they made of Babe Ruth driving a nail into a Climax tube. They made another guy, a Chillicothe man, driving a car with Climax tubes over planks filled with nails in front of the courthouse there. In Cleveland, they had a car set out there with tire with the tube in it, and they inviting people to drive nails into the tire. And then celebrities were invited to participate. And then they took a Dodge car and drove it from Akron to Worcester, drove 3 nails into a tire, then it drove to Loudonville, and then finally to Neal House in Columbus. And all 3 nails were still on the tire, and they were pulled out with no loss of air. So they were going places. They sold the rights to manufacture Maxo tires and compression inner tubes to Good Luck Rubber in Buffalo, inviting men in other states to do similar deals. Then they made a correction in the Delaware Daily Journal Herald saying that the Good Luck deal was for stock in the company, not cash. I'm sure the investors were excited about thinking it was $2.5 million in cash. They also sold the rights for English rights for $1 royalty per tube produced. The newspapers mentioned expansion in Delaware, but also mentioned incomplete financing. In 1921, quiet year, they had their annual stockholders meeting on February 11th in Columbus. In the details, interesting, they mentioned that they were the plan for facilities and intensive development by sales were fully discussed, and the company's underlying non-competitive products consisting of Maxo tires and compression air tubes, which is really what they were making. So that doesn't sound right if that's their problem. Those are their main products. But at the same time, they were actually had a subsidiary plant in Buffalo that was coming up to speed. And they were still advertising in all the different trade journals. And then in 1922, another quiet year, they donated to the Delaware YMCA. They won a lawsuit against, there was a breach of contract. From that company, they wound up obtaining a rail car load of rubber. They sued another company for trademark infringement on the compression inner tube, and they decided in their favor. In October, they acquired the rotary tube and rotary tire and rubber company of Zanesville. They were going to make Climax and compression tubes at this plant. So this is late 1922. In 1923, January, they're bankrupt. And they have more assets than liabilities, but 40% of the assets are their patents and their trademarks, not necessarily real hard assets. The real estate was about 20%. So after that, the bankruptcy court gave the Critchbaum brothers permission to restart the company as K&W Rubber, while the Climax Rubber, that got cleaned up. They sued Climax Rubber and were awarded the factory, although I couldn't find where they ever actually sold it, transferred the factory to Climax. But in any case, they've got the factory, they're back in business. They organized the new company in June of 1924, and Ora and Guy Critchbaum were officers and directors again. So they were making, I think they stopped making the Maxo tire. I would imagine tire manufacturers were coming along with better tires, with more tread, and the tire liner need for those was probably going away. So they were focused on inner tubes, and they had an inner tube trademarked as the Aero Tank. And Ora Critchbaum had filed for that trademark. And in 1924, Joe Boyer won the Indy 500 driving in Duesenberg with Aero Tank inner tubes. And at a meeting of the Retail Merchants Association, that's a typo, should be 1924, sent a cable from the Duesenberg interests, extolling the high qualities of the Aero Tank inner tubes, which they claimed contributed to winning. Then there was this is kind of just a blip. There was an article that Siler Rubber Company was going to buy the brass foundry building on East Harrison Street that we talked about earlier, and which was empty. And they were going to make inner tubes for K&W Rubber, the tubes that they were already making. $50,000 of capitalization was mostly subscribed, but that was the end of it. It never came up again. This was in 1924. So like K&W continued to make their, Siler Rubber was a real company in Chillicothe. Then K&W really focused on their aero cushions. These were air mattresses. They had auto seat cushions, tourist aid mattresses, ambulances, invalid care, child's bed aero mattresses, hot water bottles. Cora Critchbaum had 2 patents for design and methods for making inflatable objects. They had the article says they have a showroom, or they have a display at the Buckeye Hardware and Iron Company store window with their aero cushion products. They advertised in Motor Boating magazine. You can see a little place to protect your knees down there on the cushion. You can use as a life preserver if you need it, extra bonus. Then you find a lot of going through Google Books looking for K&W. They advertised in drug and chemical markets. For Modern Hospital, they made rubber invalid rings that would hang from the ceiling to help invalids with mobility. They advertised in Outdoor America, Nursing World, National Sportsman. So they were really marketing these inflatable products. Then now we're in 1937, a guy named John Johnson had a patent for making striped rubber rope and assigned the patent to K&W Rubber. And I found in a chain store manufacturing directory, K&W was listed as a company that made jump ropes. And then in 1936, the Dispatch reported that Johnson had purchased an interest in K&W. That's a photo or a drawing from the patent showing how they co-extrude 2 different colored rubber materials to make a striped rubber rope. Then there were some ownership changes. So John Johnson purchased the Delaware factory in total in 1943. He had more patents that were assigned to the company. And then the transfer deed indicated that K&W Rubber was being liquidated, and Johnson signed it as president at that time. But then Michael Broderick purchased the factory in August 11, 1944. And he ran it as the president until the dispatch reported in 1951 that he was charged with tax evasion. And in February 1952, K&W ceased operations. After that, in 1953, L. Albert and Son of Akron bought the equipment and planned to reopen as a Delaware Rubber Company, making parts for the automotive industry. But nothing seemed to happen. In 1955, they reported that Atchison Dispersed Pigments had secured the plant, and they were making base plastics and other chemicals and dyeing them for the plastics industry. And that used a lot of similar equipment to what was used for rubber works, such as mills and mixers. So that was 1955. And then in 59, looking at city directories through 62, it was vacant. Mike Broderick sold the plant to James W. Blair, trustee, in 1960. Then Broderick died in 1962. Or Critchbaum died in 1963 and is buried in Oak Grove. And then the city directory shows in 1963, it's now the county engineering building. And then Guy Critchbaum passed in 1977. He was back in Ashland, Ohio. So that was K&W Rubber and Climax Rubber, and at least it had a good run. We can go on to the Ohio Department of Transportation building, which is out on East William, just south of the Point, which has another background with rubber production. So there was a company called Rainbow Tire and Rubber Company that was founded in Columbus in 1919 by a guy named Charles E. Ross. And it's capitalized at $250K. And these were some of the officers. H.L. Gilbert, we'll talk about him later. But then there were two directors that were from Delaware, and Kerry Morrison, who was an undertaker in Delaware. He's also in the commercial club. The side story is his father-in-law was Harmon Finch, and Harmon Finch was killed in front of the county courthouse, where a guy named Wesley Martin was demonstrating his aeromobile. An aeromobile was basically an airplane without wings, but a propeller. And in the process of starting it up and starting to roll away, either it got too close to Finch or Finch got too close to it, but he got hit in the head by the propeller and was killed. So that's another story for another time. But that was Kerry Morrison's father-in-law. And then the paper said T.C. Hazard, a rubber engineer, was moving from Rochester, New York to Delaware. This came out of an India Rubber Review trade magazine from 1919. And Charles Ross had rubber experience. He lived in Hartford, Connecticut, and then he worked for Lancaster Rubber in Lancaster, Ohio. He had started a company, the Ross Lambert Rubber Company in Cincinnati, and they were going to produce what they called a truss type inner tube to replace air or pneumatic tubes. And Chris Lambert and A.B. Lambert were officers, and he was president. And the capital stock was $3 million. They said they had a large order from the British government. They were negotiating for a factory site in Cincinnati to hire 1,300 or 1,500 men. So this predates the Rainbow Rubber. This is like the backstory. And Chris Lambert received a patent for a resilient tire. It was awarded in 1922, and he assigned it to Hercules Rubber, which was another rubber company in Cincinnati. But it doesn't look like they really got started. We'll talk about that next. Here's actually the patent. So this is basically a solid rubber inner tube with all these openings that would allow it to flex. So it would be like a flexible, compressible tube, yet it doesn't contain air, so there's no risk of puncture. And it was meant to replace inflated tubes. Like I said, it was awarded in 1922 and then assigned to Hercules Rubber. I don't know the timing of this. It looks like they started Lambert and Ross Lambert in 1917, and whether they were anticipating this patent being awarded, but by 1919, they decided to come to Delaware, but they still wouldn't have had the patent awarded. They didn't really get awarded till 1922. So, and if Hercules Rubber sold it back to them or sold it back to Ross, I couldn't figure that out. But somehow they wound up coming to Delaware, and we're going to make these tires at the plant they built. Charles Ross also had another backstory. He was a private eye, and there was a biography of him in the History of Ohio by Charles Galbraith, and he was basically a Secret Service agent and known for tracking down and capturing difficult criminals. There was an article in the Dispatch that he had he was president of the Rainbow Tire and Rubber Company, and a special officer used his specially built locomobile in assisting the Vice Squad in their cleanup Saturday. But he had a whole nother life beyond running a rubber company. But in 1919, they bought 11 acres. This is out on East William Street, like I said, right just south of the point, and it's where the state garage is now. They bought the lot from Fred and Margaret Worthman. It didn't include that house that's up in the top left corner. They had a rail siding that comes up from the bottom, which would be from the south, from the Big Four Railway. They spent $175,000 on the factory. And in 1922, they reported that production was going to start in a few months. Earlier than that, they had reported there were a number of advanced orders were received, including 100,000 from a foreign concern. This is images from the 1923 Sanborn fire map. Then in the Rubber Age reported in 1922 that Kerry Morrison had recently completed the trip to Michigan, demonstrating their puncture-proof tube to several automakers, including Henry Ford's brother William, and mentioned the construction work on the plant will be pushed to completion, and production would start in 1923 in March. Then the Delaware Daily Journal Herald reported in 1925 that production would start in 2 weeks. So time's slipping by, and they're not producing tires yet, or inner tubes yet. So the problems, they reported in 1925 that the company officials met with the Delaware Chamber of Commerce. And the production of tubes was only 3 to 4 weeks away, only missing a heater and some belts. The purpose of the meeting was to iron out some understandings, and company officials said they had been led to believe Delaware as a college town did not want industry. And the Chamber of Commerce said, well, under no circumstances will they, as an organization, recommend or endorse the sale of industrial stocks to its members of the citizens of Delaware. So it looks like Rainbow was still having trouble getting investment. Then they had an annual meeting in 1926. They elected directors. Plant operation will begin in a few weeks, making the truss tube. The new furnaces are being baked out, only lacking a hydraulic pump. But then in May, there was reported in the paper that they were being sued by the Riley Stoker Corporation. The Stokers would have been for coal-fired boilers, feeding the coal into the boilers. Maybe a sign that there were some troubles. And then nothing till 1930, where the plant was being transferred to a new company, the Truss Core and Tire Company, with employment for several hundred men in the future. And there was a receiver for the Rainbow Tire and Rubber Company. And everything from Rainbow Tire and Rubber was supposed to be transferred to the new Trustcore Tire Company, Inc. And then nothing until September 1932, when the state purchased the property at a sheriff's sale for $10,000. And in 1934, they were remodeling it for the Division 6 garage. So I think that was the end of Rainbow. I don't think they ever got to production. So it comes to our third company, which is the Delaware Rubber Company. And this is an article in 1918 from the India Rubber Review that this company was founded, and the principals are listed here: H.L. Gilbert, W.E. Borden. And it's interesting, this was 1918, but above we were looking at the Rainbow Rubber in 1919, and H.L. Gilbert was listed as the vice president of Rainbow Rubber. They were going to make rubber heels and soles for shoes under the trade name Pep Step, and they were looking for a capitalization of $200,000. They were going to be located in this building, which is now under US 23, but this would have been when Henry Street went all the way up to Central. And this building was originally a warehouse for the Snyder and Morris Delaware roller mill. And you can see the old mill race is still, what's left of that is still over here on the side. This is again 1911 Sanborn fire map. This was an ad from the Delaware Daily Journal of the Pep Step, and looking for investors in the company, $100 per share. And they're only offering $25,000 in share, and it lists the officers of the company again. And then I went, and so this was 1918, and I looked in 1922, and there's no evidence of the Delaware Rubber Company. And I looked, and H.L. Gilbert is now the advertising manager at the Delaware Daily Journal Herald. Dr. W.E. Borden is an ear, nose, and throat specialist. George Blake is a salesman. Edward Mettler is a printer. Frank King is a city auditor. And these were the officers of the company. And a few years later, this is what they're doing. So that Delaware Rubber Company didn't survive either. I said in 1918, the first supply of soles and heels was on display. The company was ready for business. And then there was nothing else after that. They had offices at 59.5 North Sandusky Street. So that was one Delaware Rubber Company, but there was another one in 1923. A new firm, the Delaware Rubber Company, will start in Delaware to produce rubber toy balloons. And that was going to be housed in that same building, the old Snyder Mill warehouse. And by then it was owned by Delaware Farmers Exchange. It was going to be leased to people, they called them the Marion parties. C.H. Mansfield, the manager of the new plant, was going to move with his brother and his mother and live at 41 Montrose Avenue, but then nothing after that. So it apparently didn't survive either. In 1923, Sanborn Fire Map just called it a storage warehouse again. And that site, like I said, was covered by US 23 in the bypass in the 1960s. So it was interesting that out of all the companies we looked at, K&W was the only one that really stayed in business for any length of time and actually made products. But it also was interesting that never really saw anything about the businesses failing. Climax, they had that one article saying it was bankrupt, but nothing about investors losing money or suits, or there may have been lawsuits that weren't mentioned in the paper, but it was interesting. Things just there was a lot of buildup and then a lot looking for investment, and then it stopped. So I don't know, maybe a lot of those were scams or just the way things were, but it was kind of interesting that only one of the companies really stuck with it. And we kind of saw the same thing in the foundry business, that companies like the brass foundry didn't last very long. So that's my presentation. We'll close this down and take questions, but if anybody wants to reach out to me with questions or suggestions, there's my S. Schmitt at DelawareOhioHistory.org. And there's my cell phone number if someone wants to just call. Okay.
In the final portion of this presentation, Steve Schmitt answers questions from his virtual Zoom audience. You will see Steve while he is answering, but only the names of the people asking the questions are shown.
If anybody has any questions. So the question was, does the 50 Channing Street building today have the same footprint? I think it's been added on into the back, but I think the front is pretty much the same footprint. I haven't been there for quite a while.
Steve, I can attest that it has been added on across the back. Both an elevator, or a manned elevator shaft was added, and offices were added across the back. So it's a lot deeper than it was before. And that happened in about 1992, I believe.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
And Steve, this is Ralph. I had never heard of a locomobile, so I Googled it. Locomobile is now worth $133,000. So you should have held on to it.
Yeah, they were big, heavy cars.
So the other thing I noticed was that the rubber companies seemed to fail during World War II, which I found really interesting. My mother was a Rosie the Riveter at Eagle Rubber in Ashland during the war, and they just boomed. It's really surprising that the rubber company would have started to fail during World War II.
I think most of these were in the 20s, so they wouldn't even have gotten. They were mostly started after World War I or during World War I, but they didn't last past the early 20s. So yeah, you're right. A lot of companies would have boomed during World War II with the defense contracts.
Steve, you've used the Delaware Daily Journal Herald. Can you talk about just a little more about how you get there? And
yeah, so if you go to the just Google or search for Ohio Memories, and then you can go to their collection, and under D for Delaware, there's two hyperlinks. One goes to a whole bunch of old city directories and other things, and then one goes to the digitized Delaware Daily Journal Herald. And Susan, that goes from 1908 up to about 1930, right?
19, right now it's 1908 to 1930. Yeah. And we're adding 1905 to 1908.
Yeah.
In February. I mean, it's happening as we talk about it.
Yeah. So you can do advanced search, and you can pick like 2 words within five words of each other and search for, like, I was just getting ready for our October cemetery walk, researching a guy named Clarence Hazelton, who was a contractor that lived on Park Avenue. And I put in the 2 words, Clarence and Hazelton, and did the search, and it came up with about 60 times that he had been mentioned in the Daily Journal Herald. So I've done it for like Wesley Martin. So you can do a lot of searches with combined words and narrow your search down. Like you can do commercial club. So I found a lot of this information was searching for commercial club. Then when you're doing that, you also come across a lot of different things. And one of the things I found was the Minnelli brothers would put on vaudeville shows at the Delaware Chair Factory, which was on Flax Street. And they had an open field area. They would put up tents and do vaudeville shows there. So it's kind of fun to look. It's fun to go through those newspapers.
So Steve, getting back to these companies failing, do you have any idea, was that common then for a large percentage of startup companies to fail? And maybe is that still the case?
I think maybe part of it was the 20s, and there was a lot of speculation going on. And I think I would suspect some of this is people coming up with ideas or patents and trying to get people to speculate. with their money. I think that era was a lot of that. You know, the stock
Oh,
market
yeah,
was booming. It
okay.
led up to Black Friday in 1929, but a lot of people were borrowing money and investing money and get rich schemes. So I think there was a good bit of that going on. They were
Okay.
shopping these, they would take these proposals. Say if you had something you wanted to do, you would shop that proposal around. It's kind of like you see now with the states, companies, you know, negotiating like Amazon to get the best deal to locate a new facility and getting the states to bid against each other. So I think there was some of that going on with shopping it around the different towns and finding somebody that was willing to put their money up for it. And some of them, like the truss tire that we saw for Rainbow Rubber, really looks like, I don't believe that ever went anywhere. I'm not aware of ever seeing an actual inner tube for a vehicle made like that. I mean, maybe the closest thing would be the wheels on the lunar rover that went to the moon. So with a kind of a truss structure. So, but flats were a challenge. Yeah,
Steve, you're familiar with patents and how they work. Is there a way to look to see if those patents that were developed in the 20s and teens that you reported on are still active in some place today?
Not really. You can go to Google patent search and you can search for either by name by the inventor or the assignee over a time range. You can put in words that would relate to the kind of thing that was patented, like resilient tires or inner tubes. But whether they're still being used, they expire in 17 years, I think, is all you get. There's a lot of controversy these days about pharmaceuticals where they make a slight tweak to a formula and then they get another 17 years of a patent on a. But I did find something interesting. I was looking at this, I mentioned a couple of times Wesley Martin, the guy that built his own airplane in 1911 up on Panhandle Road and brought it into Delaware and was supposed to fly it at the pumpkin show. And I'm not going to say more. Eventually, there's going to be an article on that. But he had some patents that he won in 1930 related to engines, and they're probably not being used. But I found they'll also show you when other patents have referenced them, and there were even some recent patents for similar things that pointed back to his patent as prior art. So that was kind of interesting to see, because the patent itself, I don't think went anywhere, but other people would, in their patent search, would find it and review it and see how it relates to what they were trying to do even now. So you can be, like I said, you can go to the Google patent search and like search a number of different ways. Company names, you can look for who is like K&W Rubber was the assignee for several of those patents.
So Steve, this is Alice again. I thought it was interesting that you said that one company's officers somehow got the perception that people in Delaware didn't want industry in the town because it was a college town. That'd be an interesting thing to research, like from a historical point of view, you know, even up till today, how much of that kind of thing goes on and has gone on, and how has it affected industry moving in and all that kind of thing. Be an
Yeah,
interesting
it would
program.
be. I think I've heard that said before, you know, so I don't think it's new. I think there are a lot of people that think that. So it would be interesting to look more into that. But, you know, they had Sunray Stove right next door to Edwards Gym for a long time, which they then bought, bought the building anyway. So, yeah, but I had heard I guess growing up in Delaware, I kind of heard those kinds of words about, it was a college town and they didn't want all the industry and, yeah.
Well, there, just anecdotally, you hear about in many college towns that there's this tension, this town gown tension.
Yeah.
And you wonder how that plays into everything that goes on. If there's this kind of ivory tower perception about the rest of the people in the town, it's a big topic, obviously.
Yeah. I would say these days, at least in the big university towns like, State College or places like that, they're actually partnering. They want more industry there. So,
Steve,
yes.
I think we should thank you for your presentation, and it gave us a new view into life in Delaware
Thank
in
you.
that time period when all that other development was going on. So I'm going to say, let's thank Steve and wait to hear his next research project.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening, and